Robert is here. Robert is a mortgage, what is the exact title? Fellow in poverty at American Enterprise Institute. I've known him for 25 years at least, starting when he was the head of the Child Support Enforcement Program in New York, which was an amazing program and did a lot for kids, I'll tell you, because they really collected a lot of money in New York. And then he went on to run virtually all welfare programs in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg, and I think for both his entire time as mayor, right? Or close to it?
Last 7 years.
Last 7 years, okay. So, Robert, let's hear what you have to say.
Sure. Thank you, Ron. I really appreciate being given this opportunity. It's nice to be here, and as someone who spent almost 20 years working in New York City and state to make our programs work to reduce child poverty, I'm glad we're having this discussion. But having said that, let me start out by saying that the Universal Child Allowance seems to me to be another step to make the federal government the source of all things. It would, as its authors contend, quote, establish the principle that all children are entitled to public support. Sounds nice, I think. But to me, and I'm sure to other conservatives, there has been some damage done by this widespread belief that all things come from the government, especially the federal government. What about the principle that all children are entitled to the support of their parents, their neighbors, and their communities? A universal child allowance paid through a monthly cash payment loaded on a ubiquitous federally issued electronic benefit card would establish at birth a financial relationship between the federal government and every citizen, and in the process will undermine the role of the individual, the parent, the extended family, and the neighbor. Point two, there is very little in the two papers on the impact on work, earnings, and labor force participation in the United States, despite the grudging, and I might say very grudging, recognition that our work and work support system has significantly reduced child poverty. I got into the social services in New York in the mid-1990s when child poverty, as measured by the supplemental method produced by Chris, was 28%. It's now 16.7%. That's a big drop. Why not focus on extending those gains through greater attention to increasing work and earnings? And given that I believe that expansions of non-work tested components of the safety net, SNAP, Medicaid, and SSI, have led to reductions in work and earnings, I'm pretty sure that adding this new benefit without a work test will increase the work disincentives in our safety net program. And it's important to remember that the way work disincentives work is not through one individual program, but through the combination of several programs. So those of us who want to reduce child poverty should be concerned about that. For a household with a single parent and 2 children, a child allowance plus SNAP and Medicaid and without any earnings is still going to be poor. In fact, their income is still going to be below 50% of the poverty measure. But they may be well enough off so as to not work even though work is available. So it is possible that we may get more poverty by providing a benefit and encouraging less work. My point is that for low-skilled parents to escape poverty, you need both earnings and support. And I think the balance has already tilted too much away from work, and this will take it still further, which will make poverty reductions harder to achieve. And I guess here I should say that I am not persuaded, and I think other FAIR experts are also not convinced, that the main argument for why we should consider this, that deep poverty for children has grown because of the too rigorous implementation of TANF work requirements, really holds up. In fact, I think a fair reading of the data shows that that thesis doesn't hold up at all. Now, I want to be clear. Deep poverty has not gotten worse because of TANF. While deep poverty has not gotten worse because of TANF, deep poverty among children is still a problem. And I have said for some time that government caseworkers in programs such as SNAP and Medicaid, when presented with parents who say they have no earnings, but all they want is SNAP and Medicaid, should not say, as they have been saying, oh, that's okay. Let me get you food stamps and Medicaid and see you in a year. Instead, they should say, how can I help you get a job? Because you and your children cannot escape poverty on food stamps and Medicaid alone. Point 3. The proposals being discussed here could be seen by some as another, maybe final step in our federal government saying that fathers are unnecessary, not even worth engaging. I'm sorry to say that, but I checked, and there's only one word about the absent parent in these papers, and that was in the Niskana paper. There is also too little recognition that poverty among children is most often related to single-parent households. I'm not going to go into all of the arguments on why we should talk about that, except to say that if you want conservatives to support greater efforts to help poor children, and I want them to do that as well, one place to start is to acknowledge forcefully and without having to be asked the role of the family, two parents, and marriage. Think of it as a credibility check. You want them to believe your models predicting future poverty reductions if only they go along with one more transfer payment. Well, at least you could start out by showing that you will talk about this issue of family formation in a way that makes them believe you. I don't have time to talk very much about child support enforcement, except to say that the papers say nothing about that program. This once broadly bipartisan supported program still brings more than 1 million children out of poverty every year, and yet one reason we are considering a universal child allowance is because absent parents are not providing enough. Why not at least address ways to ensure, especially if you're going to provide a new cash benefit, that the absent parents at least provide something? Finally, cost. We are already overcommitted in our government, but I would say that more spending for children, if the pay-for was a true facing up to our long-term fiscal problem. I would prefer to see reforms which reduce our expected spending for retirees or senior citizens in order to invest in programs for children. And this is a place where leadership from progressives would be especially helpful in striking a grand bargain for children. Now, I know that there may not be a lot of hope for a grand bargain for children, but I've had this hope for a long time, since I first heard Belle Sawhill talk about it here at Brookings, and I'm not going to stop hoping now. Finally, if we are all going to do one thing, just one thing, is this it? What about training and education, subsidized jobs programs, reentry assistance for people coming home from prison, and employment for disconnected men? We could do a lot more there with less money than what these proposals cost. Thank you.
Okay, so let's begin with this. I think there's agreement here. You thought that some of it was a little bit hesitant, but there does seem to be, and has for at least a decade now, that we have done a lot to reduce poverty by encouraging people to work and subsidizing the work. So we have the most successful anti-poverty strategy the nation's ever had is to encourage work and subsidize the work. And it's worked very well, as several people here have shown, and I don't think anybody said anything negative about that. All right, that's a victory. That's good. It happened. It represents a huge change on the left, because the left was really seriously in opposition to this measure back in 1996. And we argued about low-income women and whether they really could work. A lot of Democrats were worried about that. I think it was a legitimate concern. It turned out most of them could work and did work. Now, because of the characteristics of some single women, some men as well, many men as well, it's much more difficult for a fairly substantial fraction of them to hold down a job. Then we've had economic changes as well. There are changes in the job market. So a big argument on behalf of this kind of benefit is that it would be the opposite of work plus work support. We wouldn't expect there would be a group of people that wouldn't work, and we would give them a free and clear benefit. That's the idea. It costs quite a bit. We'll come back to that in just a minute. What's your problem with that diagnosis of the problem?
Well, the basis of it is that we had this argument about whether AFDC moms could work, and those who thought they could, and they could be the true heroes of welfare reform, as President Clinton used to say, turned out to be correct. Big jump in labor force participation by never married mothers in a way that no one ever expected. They showed that once asked, they could do it. But there is a group that right now appears to be on SNAP and Medicaid and is not working. And we want to know what's going on with them. And my view is that they have stepped away from the work requirements of TANF and are not being engaged significantly. The other thing I want to point out, I just want to say one more thing, the single mothers. But I want to just say one thing. I think through most of the conversation today, we have not said anything about SSI or disability. And in the welfare programs I ran in New York City, one component of our approach was when people said they could not work due to a health or physical impairment, there was a path toward SSI that allowed them to have support. And I sometimes think in the rhetoric up here, when people say there is no floor for people who can't work, there may be some misperception that doesn't exist, but it does exist. And so I'm not, and that's where I am. I think that, and I would also say that if Scott Winship wasn't, in my opinion, correct, that the problem has not gotten worse, I'd be more concerned about it. But I don't see it. Okay. I don't even see it in the very low food security numbers, which have come up a little bit in the wake of the recession, but I'm not sure they had to do with,
But as a matter of principle, it really doesn't make any difference if they've increased. If it is the case that there's a group at the bottom that does not qualify for SSI or SSDI, and they cannot work consistently because of where they live, because of their personal habits, whatever it ought to be, and we have a desire to protect their children, there is some rationale for a program like a universal benefit that is not dependent on work.
There is some rationale for an effort at some level, community, state, town, village, to assist those families. I don't know that the rationale is for a federal universal benefit that may have unintended consequences for the families that went to work. Remember, whenever you want to adjust what you're providing, you're going to have the adjustment that'll benefit that person who you're trying to help, but it also will send a message or provide an assistance to a group that may not have needed that. And that's what I worry about. If you have an entitlement system that allows more people to not work, more people will not work. And I don't think that's good.
The issue is the size of that effect. We have a zillion literature reviews, including by the person I think is most confident, this is Robert Moffat, and the effects are almost inevitably small. I don't think you can show that there's a huge impact on low income, I'm especially concerned with mothers, that they are going to stop working in droves because they can get this $250 a month benefit.
So here I am informed by my experience in New York City. We had a strong work requirement. We had a modest recession in 2001. The Bush administration and others expanded access to SNAP and changed the rules there. President Obama continued that and increased access to public health insurance, reduced application processes. You can self-attest income for Medicaid in New York now. I think you can do it around the country. There is no asset test. And our gains in reducing poverty stopped in that period between the small recession in 2001 and the Great Recession in 2007. And I believe that happened because there was an ability for folks to knit together a variety of assistances that made them work less. And I think that's unfortunate.
Then why are more of them working now?
Well, we went through
the last 3 years, the work rate among single mothers has started increasing again.
It has, and I think that's partly because the economy has finally come back, and partly because people have begun to wonder about that a little bit. And even the Obama administration began to send messages to the SNAP programs, hey, maybe we should talk about work a little bit. So I agree with you. It has come back. I think that's mostly due to the economy, not due to changes in the underlying program.
No, but if they have an incentive not to work, and then jobs become more available and they go to work.
Well, that's true. I should also point out that, and this is a long, long battle and really taken way too long, but some wages have risen a little bit too. So I think the fact that the labor force participation is finally coming back is due to a variety of factors, and I like it that way. I want that to continue. I don't want to stop it by providing another benefit that has no work test.
Okay, responsive to your concerns about non-work, what would you think of a compromise that would include some benefit at the bottom, but would also greatly strengthen the work requirements in the food stamp program and the Medicaid program? You might want to leave Medicaid out because people are still very...
Yeah. That's a hard
Especially
one.
about Medicaid.
That's a hard one. That's a legitimate... I mean, one of the problems that I have is that I relate it to my experience in New York, and we had some protections for people at the very bottom. We didn't have a firm 5-year time limit. We transitioned people to the state program, and we didn't have a full family sanction. And we had this sort of effort on people with disabilities who said they couldn't work. So I'd be interested in that. I mean, I don't want to be associated with anyone who wants me to say that the current TANF program now, as it's administered in the states, is perfect. It's not. And that may be contributing to the fact that some families are being left behind. But again, you keep coming back to where is it in the big data? If it was in the big data in a significant way, what is in the big data is that in 1993, child poverty, as measured by Chris, was 28%. And it really did feel like this was a problem that could not be solved. And now it's 16.7%. And that's a pretty big drop that we need to be careful about going backwards on.
You recall that at the beginning I said we were...
Yeah, I got that.
I forgot about that. Agreed that that's because more people work and they get better benefits when they work. We can truly... My vision was always a social worker can look a mother in the eye and say, if you work even at $9 an hour, you are going to be better off because we're going to make sure you get the ITC, food stamps, yada, yada.
And one more thing. I very little discussion in these papers about the implications of the federalization of this. I think Chris said this SSA administration would run it. In New York City, in terms of sort of client relationships or dealings with people, it's not one of the great programs of all time. I mean, I'm not comfortable with that.
What, Social Security?
I'm not comfortable with saying that we're going to address this program entirely from the federal government. There ought to be some recognition that we have this apparatus in the states that isn't perfect, but maybe a better way to address this issue.
Okay, well, I suggest you write more about that because I'd like to see an alternative to SSA too. The people at SSA are busy and they do make mistakes, and giving them another enormous job like this.
So the point's a valid one.
Universal will be huge. So I'm not sure SSA is the greatest answer, although it may be the best. Okay, let's talk about fathers now. You want fathers to play a role in this. Ironically, in the same welfare reform bill where we increase work requirements for mothers, we put really tough requirements on fathers. And they, by and large, have worked pretty well, especially if you look at the first, say, 8 to 10 years, the child support payments did increase quite a bit. What would you do now to increase child support payments? I mean, they seem to have be fairly flat now, and there are a lot of fathers, especially the probability that you have a father that will pay child support for this group that we're concerned about is very low relative to other fathers.
Well, I think the progress was very solid in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then in a reaction to a problem, which was that the program could be excessively harsh on particularly poor and struggling non-custodial parents, it adjusted. And in addition, single moms decided not to apply for TANF where there was a clear requirement that they cooperate. And I actually think that we're not doing as much as we could to draw in these non-resident parents who could pay something. But in a study, I talked to someone in a major child support program in a major city. And they, in an effort to be careful about getting, overly harsh orders, had almost 50% of their new orders were for $0. That's not child support collections. That's not helping get money into households. That's just going through a bureaucratic process to meet some federal performance standard, and it's not really helping. So my view, what I've said, is that for single-parent households who are applying for SNAP, we ought to have a required referral to child support when she or he says, no, I have no agreement and I'm getting no child support. And we ought to ask them to go and work with the child support program to help get them something. And I associate myself with those who said earlier, I think, that when you pay child support, you're more likely to be positively engaged with your child, and that emotional and parental attention is important too. I want that. I don't think you get that when you
But
aren't.
to the extent that we can use child support as another mechanism to fill that problem at the bottom, you're going to get fathers that heretofore have not been cooperative. I was hoping you'd say that we could have a much stronger work program for fathers. We could work much
Yes.
harder on that. We've got 10 states or 8 now. In fact, one of the sponsors, the University of Wisconsin, is doing one of the big random assignment studies to figure out if there are ways to get the fathers to work. The initial
Yes.
studies in Texas were very encouraging. Maybe
Right.
that's a way to do it.
A significant portion of income that comes into poor single-parent households does come from child support when they get it. And we should try to help that happen more often. And one way we should have it more happen is by doing a better job in establishing and collecting dollars at an appropriate amount. And another way is to allow the child support enforcement program to have work programs that engage non-custodial parents. I absolutely agree with that. I also think we should have a targeted non-custodial parent EITC benefit. So there are ways I want to get more money into these households, and I think running to the universal benefit as the first answer is premature.
Okay, so now if we were talking to Republicans on the Hill, I think that a big issue would come up immediately, which is $200 billion? Are you kidding me? $200 billion a year for this program? Who could possibly support that? We're not going to support a $200 billion a year program. And even with the offsets that have been proposed here, you get it down to $96 billion. Down to 96, I mean, really. What do you think the practical chances are that Republicans on the Hill would accept a program of this magnitude?
Well, I'm very bad at predicting what Republicans...
Oh, we all are, but we don't let that stop us.
I think it's not good at all. I think that it's, crazy. I mean, the only way it might happen is if you traded in, the panoply, a collection of programs, some of which work, by the way, or pretty well, and some of which don't, and said, we'll close all these and we'll create this money, but the Democrats are never going to allow that. So, no, I don't think there's much of a chance of it at all. So I'd rather focus on other
So
things.
let me ask you a more difficult question of the same type. What do you think the chances are the Democratic Congress would figure out a way to get $100 billion for a program like this, or $200 billion?
I don't know. I guess you're trying to get me to say that there's not much chance of it at all, and I could say that. But I do want to say that I wish we could have an effort to find more money and investments for children by reorganizing our safety net programs and our entitlement programs that are overly generous toward the upper middle class. And I'm all for that, but I want to do it in a way that's successful. That really is anyway.
Okay, so let me raise one more issue that has to do with the money, because I want people to really reflect on what we're asking for here. And that is, even though Congress seems to deny it, even 4, 5, 6 years ago, we had a huge movement to try to do something about the nation's debt. And we had some very good proposals on the table, and for one reason or another, we could never reach any kind of compromise. So we really have not done anything serious about the debt, and it continues to grow. It will soon be bigger than the debt after World War II, 15 or 20 years from now. And all the major institutions in Washington that are responsible for government, CRS, OMB, not OMB, I'm sorry, CRS, the Congressional Budget Office, and other organizations are really concerned about the debt. So, leaving alone how you spend the money, can you imagine asking for increasing the debt another $100 billion or $200 billion a year?
Well, I should have amended my comment about Republicans. There is one way that Republicans would make a significant increase in transfer payments for poor families. And they've done it. And it is when the Democrats go in and tell them it's just a tax cut. The ITC expansion is a tax cut. And it's a way to make your big tax cut plan look a little more fair to lower income families. They've done that several times. And it works with Republicans. So the one way that could happen is if somehow we can make a refundable universal allowance, and Democrats will love this. They will be very happy to let Republicans call that a tax cut, but it's not.
It's hard to believe that you could pull. I worked with the Ways and Means Committee for 14 years, and I saw very few Republicans who didn't realize an EITC is not a tax cut, it's refundable, and you give them money. It's like a spending program.
Yeah, but I also saw those public documents that came out and tried to show the benefits of this tax reform that included an increase in the ITC. And when it looked at benefits for families at the bottom, it included the dollars and still called it tax reform.
If you were going to make a recommendation to help this group at the bottom, now Scott was the only person that made I think, an argument that the group, there isn't a worse off group at the bottom. But he did not argue that there isn't a group at the bottom that has a lot of trouble.
He said if they were in this room, he'd want to help them.
Yeah.
Right,
But
so would I.
I don't think
Yeah, I got it.
it's more than 20. Okay, so what is your solution? Tell me what you would do to help this group.
Well, so I've talked about bringing a little more work focus to SNAP and Medicaid, where all this group is, by the way. Let's be very clear about that. I mean, Kathy, everyone agrees. They're on SNAP and they're on Medicaid. So we have an avenue to at least talk to them. We know where they are. And as a former administrator, I could walk into my SNAP director's office and I could say, I want the list in zip code 11201 of every household with a single parent and kids that reports no earnings on SNAP and is not on TANF. And I get it by a day later. And then I'd give it to the SNAP administration and say, what are we doing about this? Isn't there something we can do? We're at full employment.
All right, so they're out
That's
there in
one
this
thing.
room. What are you going to tell them?
What do you mean?
What are you going to tell these guys that are running these programs?
I'm going to say pay more attention to employment and track it, let us know. We want to know. I think there was an earlier chart that Kathy did put up, which showed the number of SNAP recipients with no earnings. Well, that's a problem. And I think to run to a universal credit is the answer when we have a program that talks to these families once a year at least and provides an important assistance I don't get that.
So strengthening work requirements.
That's
is
one. The other thing is I would have an administration, this is a little strong, I want to be, this may not be totally fair, but I think that there are problems in TANF, and I think we could do more to get TANF dollars directed and focused on families that are below the poverty line, and I think we could work on that without giving in the work requirement.
Audience, questions of this young man?
I'm right in the back. There's the first hand.
Tell us your name and then ask a question, please.
I'm Morgan Golan. I work for Feeding America. I just have a quick question about, there's been some data that's recently come out saying that there's...
Can you hold the mic a little closer? It's hard to hear.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Saying that there's a racial disparity in wealth between minority families and families who are white. So if there's a focus on work and things like that, training and education, but the rate of return of an increase in a dollar in income isn't necessarily equivalent to the increase in wealth. So, for example, a minority family who has an income increase in a dollar, the wealth increase does not equate to a dollar, whereas for a white family, it might be more similar. Mm-hmm. So training families who are on SNAP and on TANF who are majority minority families, how would that equate for you? Because giving them a job might not necessarily pull them out of poverty the same way it would for a white family, for example.
Well, I'm not familiar with the studies that you're referring to, and it may be true. I take it for granted that it's true, that effect is not as strong for African Americans or Hispanics than it is for white families. I don't know what you would do to ensure that that disbalance was fixed by the welfare system. In New York City, we had welfare recipients and welfare applicants who were white and who were black and who were Latino and who were Asian. And it's very hard to run a welfare program that has a work focus or not that can make adjustments based on race.
Other questions?
They've had enough of me.
Either that or both of us.
Well, it's me, Ron, I promise.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Give that gentleman a microphone.
First of all, thank you for your time. So my name is Deandre Jones, and I'm an Emerson Hunger Fellow at the Food Research and Action Center. And so my worry on work requirements is that it inherently punishes children for the decisions of the parents, and children are typically the most vulnerable populations and the target population for this proposal. So how do we as a society best support the children of the parents that are not working? Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so, one thing about work requirements is that people want to say that the way a work requirement exists is if you don't have a job, you don't get the benefit. And that's really not the right way to implement a work requirement. Really, the work requirement is on the agency to focus on employment as they serve the person that they're seeing. That they need to ask about earnings. They need to talk about a program or a place that someone can go to get prepared for work. They maybe have an obligation to find a job that they can offer. And then only when a person declines that opportunity is a sanction come into play. And my general view is that the sanction should affect the benefits associated with the parent, not with the child, when we're talking about SNAP. So my view is that we're actually more likely to help families when we address issues of employment and the absent parent's financial contribution than when we just ignore them.
When you recall that we organized a group, AEI Brookings group, on how to solve poverty, and we had there's several people in this room who were on that group, and we had a long discussion about what happens if we have a work requirement and people don't work. And after a lot of discussion, we got to the idea that there should be graduated reductions in benefit, but you could never end people's benefit. This would solve a big problem in TANF if they had this provision, unless you had offered them an actual job and they turned it down. So this would put the government, I can hear you talking right now, in the business of finding jobs and offering them to people. But that would be the only condition. And I have a feeling that's going to be a part of the debate if we want to strengthen work requirements in any other program. Would you agree with doing that?
In the context of SNAP, I would. But I think I know that there may be people here that are going to find this shocking, but it happened in New York. And there are people who, when you offer them a job that's within reasonable transportation, and you say, we want to provide you SNAP, and SNAP will continue with you because it's a work support. So, there are people who will say, no, I'm not taking that. So I viewed it, and this, I don't want to upset you, Jane, but I viewed this as a concession.
This is referring to old conversations we had that lasted
but
a long time.
But I viewed it as a concession from progressives, acknowledging that the government had a responsibility to have a consequence when someone who was offered a job declined.
Well, that's essentially the answer to the gentleman's question, right? A question over here. Jared, was that you that raised your hand? Made Jean, okay.
Well, this is before Bob upset.
Someone's dashing up here, wait.
I'm not upset. Bob, your opening comment was about, Robert, your opening comment was about the federal role versus state and local. So way back when I was a social worker in Massachusetts, there was something called general relief or general assistance. So these were state and local programs that provided cash to families or to individuals with no work requirement. And that was some time ago that I was doing that work and so what's happened to those programs, and do those still exist in much of the country, some of the country? What's been the trajectory? Because implicitly you're saying, well, maybe we could have a program like this, but I think it'd be better at a state or local level. So it made me think about these old state programs, whether you call them GR or GA, public assistance they were called in some places. I think in New York, the Northeast used to have them.
We had a safety net program.
So do these still exist, and in how much of the country?
Well, I don't think they exist in very much of the country. I think that's definitely true. That's not to say that there aren't other vehicles in communities around the country to provide assistance to poor families outside of the federal benefit programs or the state programs. So, the answer to that, states I acknowledge, are not perfect, and blue states are often just as bad as red states. And so I guess I would say that I do have some, while I like the federal government, federal government's fine, I have there's a certain history of the federal government. I have, in some areas, I like state responsibilities because they're closer to the problem. But we have to be active in the states. I mean, one of the criticisms of some of the speakers we've had earlier is that why didn't they take this argument to the states, to Illinois, or to places where there was this walking away from families in need?
Maria, in the back.
So, Robert, I'd like to dispute your characterization of TANF just a little bit, to say I think both the left and the right were wrong. So I would say the left, myself included, was wrong about how few moms would be able to get jobs. I think conservatives were wrong about the implications of those jobs. So we had this vision about how many people would get jobs, and then they would have employment, and that would lead to the next thing, and they would suddenly be middle class. Yeah. And I think what we've found is that a substantial proportion of people can go to work, and that work isn't enough. And so 2 questions about pushing work in place of one is, what makes us think that we have a labor market that is structured in such a way that is going to provide the kind of consistent and sufficient income that families with children need? And I would say that most of the ways to try to move in that direction, coming from Wisconsin, are very expensive. So why, I think the idea of very expensive, subsidized childcare, get coaching, create the job, that makes sense if you have an argument that once somebody gets a job, they get launched, and then in year 2, 3, and 4, they're going to be fine. But the evidence that we have is a lot of these folks stay at the bottom. And so then how is this how are we going to do this?
That's a really very good question, and one that I struggle with a lot in New York. And the way I came to it, resolved it, was various institutions in society have different roles. And the anti-poverty fighters who for some time failed, but could, through this combination of work and work supports, help people get over the poverty line. And we acknowledge the poverty line is low. Other institutions in American life are responsible for the next step. Not because I don't want to help with that, but because I think that if you make the poverty fighters responsible for middle-class wages, getting people middle-class wages, they won't get the middle-class wages, and they won't get them above the poverty line. They'll fail at both. So I absolutely agree, and I want to be clear about the successes of welfare reform. We got people up a little bit above a fairly low starting line, and they are still struggling, but it's not 28%. It's 16.7%.
Irv Garfinkel up here.
So, Robert, when I listen to you, it sounds like you give absolutely zero weight to evidence from other countries. And my question is, why? I don't get that.
That,
I'm going to give you time to think for a second.
Yeah.
Will you give us one sentence or two sentences about why we should pay attention to other countries? What specific issues are you thinking he's ignoring?
The lessons are that in Canada and the UK, which are like us, they're English speaking, but you can go to more foreign countries like Sweden. The poverty reduction comes from government benefits.
I have to say you're absolutely right that I give that line of rhetoric very little credit. And I've heard it. Jane uses it very effectively and with great humor. But yeah, she is. But I have to say that, but I don't really know why. I need to study that a little closer. I acknowledge that, and I want to, and I will. But I want to say one more thing, and that is, if you think that rhetoric will be helpful with Ron and my friends in the Republican conference, if you think I don't like it much, they really don't like it. It is just, I've seen it. It's not something they want to hear. And I guess I'd have one other question, and this is really unfair, and I don't know the answer to this. Where do low-skilled people from other countries go when they want to go someplace to have a better life? I think a lot of them come to New York City. And I don't know.
That was when you were running the welfare.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Samuel.
I knew that was a bad comment. That was a bad one.
Well, I just want to point out that the Republicans have no problem comparing other countries when they're talking about the corporate tax rate, right?
Very good point. That's a very good point.
So I come from Canada, and right now, if you get the child benefit for, let's say you have 2 kids under 6, you're going to be taking home unconditionally $12,800. And we have, nonetheless, a higher top-line labor force participation rate than the United States. So I get this feeling that there's a part of the parochialism, both geographically but also temporally with welfare reform, is that we have like this thin-skin view of the labor market where you prick it and it falls apart. But that's where Irv's point comes in. If you look internationally, and I think, people respond to incentives, and it's not like workers in the U.S. Are dramatically different, like they have a different kind of psyche or rationality when it comes to labor force incentives. And when that evidence is excluded, I think it really narrows the aperture on the kind of debate we have.
I need to work a little harder on non-United States policies. I don't know the answer. I've got to think about that.
You knew the session's about that and you want to get out of here.
Yeah.
So join me in thanking Robert for